Annabelle Winslow had designed buildings all her life: public spaces, libraries, municipal centers, projects guided by codes, permits, and a sense of civic responsibility. For years, her work had been methodical and driven by function more than flair. But when she finally stepped away from the rigid contracts of government architecture, she found herself craving something different, something for herself. A house. Not just a house, but a private, personal structure she could build from scratch, no compromises, no committees. Her own sanctuary. She'd spent decades shaping the lives of others through concrete and steel. Now, she would create something that reflected who she really was. It was not a midlife crisis. It was a reclaiming. The plot she purchased wasn't glamorous, but it was deliberate. On the edge of a quiet residential street near the outskirts of town, the lot was bordered by older homes, some updated, others frozen in time. It was just far enough from the city to feel detached, but close enough for regular supply deliveries and inspections. The lot had sat undeveloped for years, overgrown, boxed in by neighbors who'd long ago stopped expecting anything to be done with it. But Annabelle saw the potential instantly. The ground was stable. The view to the west gave open skies at sunset. And perhaps most importantly, the lot allowed her full creative control. It was not governed by a formal association, though a loose-knit group of longtime residents often acted as if it were. That didn't concern her, at least not yet. Her design was bold, nothing like the cozy symmetry of the neighboring ranch houses or the pastel-colored bungalows with their friendly porches and ornamental shutters. Annabelle's vision was a long, low-slung concrete and glass form with narrow vertical windows and a facade of weathered steel. Stark but warm, modern but grounded. She wanted the building to grow out of the earth like it belonged there, something almost geological in its presence. It would have privacy, silence, and a kind of subtle defiance. No white picket fences. No flower boxes. It would be a statement, but not one shouted. She thought the neighbors might find it strange. She didn't expect hostility. From the start, there were looks. On the day ground was broken, she noticed an older woman standing across the street, arms folded, watching the excavation crew as if they were vandalizing sacred ground. She had carefully coiffed silver hair, a stiff blouse tucked into slacks, and the hard expression of someone who'd long ago stopped hiding her judgment behind polite smiles. She didn't say anything that day, but she stared for nearly 20 minutes before turning sharply and walking away. One of the younger workers noticed too. "That lady give anyone else the creeps?" he muttered. Annabelle just said, "Ignore it. People always have opinions." She was used to scrutiny from decades of public sector work. This was nothing new. But over the next few days, the same woman, Karen, as Annabelle would soon learn, kept reappearing. Sometimes she stood with her hands on her hips, sometimes with a small dog on a leash she barely pretended to walk. She never addressed Annabelle directly, but she made comments to others loud enough to be overheard. "Monstrosity," she said one morning to a man gardening across the street. "It's a bunker, not a home." When a delivery truck blocked the road briefly while offloading rebar, Karen called out to the driver, "You people think you can just disrupt the neighborhood like this? This is a residential zone, not an industrial park." Annabelle didn't bite. She knew better. The escalating would only feed it. Instead, she focused on the work. The foundation was poured, framing began, and her crew moved steadily. She paid above average, required permits for everything, and held weekly check-ins with her project lead. Every detail was in place. There was no reason to expect anything but a smooth build until the day she found paint splattered near the front of the lot. It wasn't graffiti. It wasn't even sprayed. It looked like someone had thrown a half-empty gallon of white latex across the temporary fence and let it burst open on impact. The splatter had stained fresh plywood sheathing and left a crusted mess on the gravel path used by the crew. At first, Annabelle thought it might have been an accident, kids, maybe, or a careless passerby. But the placement was too deliberate. There were no tracks, no other trash, no signs of random mischief. It felt personal. And when she glanced across the street, and saw Karen standing at her gate, sipping coffee from a mug, not looking away. Annabelle knew. Still, she didn't react. She took photos, called her site manager, and had the crew document it. They cleaned up the mess and moved on. Accidents happen, but the following week, a toolbox was tampered with. One of the workers, Luis, a reliable man in his late 30s, reported that several tools were missing, only to find them hidden inside a stack of discarded insulation boards later that day. When asked if he'd moved them, he said no, none of the crew had. Annabelle began to wonder if they were being watched more closely than she'd realized. Then came the morning Karen crossed the line, literally. It was early, before 8 a.m. The site had just started to stir to life. Luis and another worker were reviewing blueprints while unpacking paint supplies for the exterior priming scheduled that day. Karen, unannounced, uninvited, and clearly unhinged, stormed past the caution tape, marched directly onto the gravel approach, and grabbed the nearest open bucket of primer. No one had time to stop her. With a twisted smile and a theatrical grunt, she hurled the bucket in a wide arc, splattering white paint across the scaffolding, over the site sign, and most devastatingly onto Luis's arm and face. He staggered back, slipping slightly, and shouted in pain. The primer had gotten into his eyes and nose, and he dropped to his knees, clutching his face. The other worker froze, stunned, before snapping into action and pulling Luis away. Karen stood there for a moment longer, as if expecting applause. When she received only shouts and swearing, she turned on her heel and strode off the site, brushing her hands on her trousers like a woman who'd just completed a necessary chore. Annabelle wasn't on site at that moment, but she arrived 10 minutes later to find the crew in chaos, Luis being helped into her car by the site's supervisor, and a trail of white footprints leading back to the street. The supervisor was already on the phone with emergency services, and Annabelle didn't hesitate. She drove Luis directly to urgent care. That incident changed everything. It wasn't just a nuisance anymore. It wasn't passive-aggressive commentary or interference. It was physical, violent, and targeted. There was no ambiguity now. Karen had crossed into criminal behavior, and Annabelle knew exactly what needed to happen next. She returned to the site 2 hours later, after making sure Luis was receiving treatment. A report had already been filed with the responding officer. Witness statements were taken. And more importantly, the motion-activated surveillance camera mounted at the southwest pole had captured everything start to finish, clean, clear, and time-stamped. There would be no confusion, no debate. It was no longer a matter of neighborhood disputes or clashing aesthetics. It was assault. Annabelle didn't confront Karen. She didn't ring her doorbell or make threats. She called her attorney. She provided the footage, the medical paperwork, and the contractor's incident report. She took the proper steps not out of fear, but out of clarity. This wasn't something to be solved with words. It was time to let the law do what it was supposed to do. And as the sun dipped low behind the frame of her unfinished home, Annabelle stood at the edge of the property and looked out across the street. In the house with the blue shutters, the neatly trimmed hedges, the woman behind the curtain peeking as always. Annabelle didn't wave. She didn't glare. She just looked and turned back toward the scaffolding, where her house, her vision, and her line in the sand were already rising. By the time Annabelle finished submitting the formal police report, Luis had been treated and discharged with a chemical burn diagnosis and an ophthalmologist's follow-up scheduled for the next day. The primer hadn't permanently damaged his vision, but the swelling was severe, and he wouldn't be returning to work for at least 2 weeks. His wife had been called. She'd picked him up from the urgent care center, shaken and angry. Luis hadn't wanted to file anything against the woman. He was quiet, reserved, the kind of man who liked to finish a job and go home, but his wife insisted. "If we let people like her get away with this, they'll never stop," she told Annabelle over the phone. Annabelle agreed, but she didn't say much. She was past the phase of outrage. What she felt now was precision and eerie calm that sharpened her thoughts like a whetstone to a blade. The officer who took her statement was professional but cautious. He noted the footage, the injury, the witness statements, and told her it would be submitted for review by the district attorney. Assault charges could follow, but these things take time, he said with a polite shrug, as if anticipating her impatience. Annabelle didn't push. She'd been in government long enough to know how slow and cautious public systems moved, especially when the accused was a long-term resident with a relatively clean record and a network of passive allies. She was more interested in stabilizing the project. The work couldn't continue with uncertainty hanging over the crew, and she knew that perception was everything. If subcontractors thought the job was cursed or worse, dangerous, they'd begin pulling out, and no amount of contract enforcement could drag them back. So she did what competent leaders do in a crisis. She controlled what she could. She called in additional security fencing. Not the thin plastic mesh kind, but steel panel barriers 8 feet tall and anchored with sandbags. She didn't ask for HOA permission, because there wasn't one, and technically the lot was hers to protect. Within a day, the entire perimeter had been reinforced, locked from within with a coded entry pad and a camera posted on each corner. Some of the neighbors watched the new fencing go up with visible discomfort. One woman across the street called the police to report a suspicious enclosure, only to be told it was fully legal. Another man stopped one of the workers as he unloaded a generator and asked, "Are you building a prison or a house?" The worker just smirked and walked away. The tone had shifted, and Annabelle felt it like pressure in the air before a storm. Karen, of course, didn't go silent. She didn't speak to Annabelle directly, that wasn't her style, but she found other outlets. Handwritten flyers began appearing in neighborhood mailboxes. On them were blurry stills of Louise from the week prior, taken from across the street or through a vehicle window. The image quality was poor, but the text was loud and clear. "Who is working next door to you?" Followed by baseless accusations about criminal backgrounds and supposed incidents that had never occurred. She described Annabelle as an out-of-town developer who brought in volatile laborers with no accountability and called the project a risk to community standards. Annabelle wasn't shocked by the smear campaign. She'd seen people use fear to leverage control before, dressed up in nicer words maybe, couched in policy meetings and concerned citizen groups, but it was the same pattern. Undermine, isolate, discredit. What frustrated her was the quiet compliance of the others. People who had waved politely at her during the first weeks now avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped when she approached. No one said they supported Karen, but no one pushed back either. That vacuum of decency felt louder than any accusation. Still, Annabelle had leverage Karen didn't know about. She wasn't a visitor to the system, she'd worked inside it. She called her attorney, a direct, unpretentious woman named Harriet Coates, who had once worked as a municipal prosecutor and now specialized in civil litigation. Annabelle laid out the facts, sent the footage, the medical files, the police report, and the flyers. Harriet didn't offer platitudes. She told her what could be done, what couldn't, and what would take time. "You've got enough to support criminal charges, if the DA moves on it," Harriet said after reviewing everything. "But I wouldn't count on speed. Older, long-time residents like her usually get the benefit of the doubt until something snaps hard." She paused. "That said, the flyers cross a line. That's defamation. We'll pursue a civil claim on that front." "And the physical trespass?" "That opens her up to a restraining order." Annabelle nodded, phone to ear, standing in the unfinished skeleton of what would be her living room. Beams cast diagonal shadows across the ground, and she could see daylight through the studs. "Do it," she said simply. "Push on all fronts." Harriet got to work immediately. The defamation complaint was drafted and filed within 72 hours. A request for a protective order was submitted to the court with a copy of the video, including Karen's full-body entry onto the restricted site and her retreat. The injuries to Louise gave weight to the filing. By the following week, a temporary order was issued, prohibiting Karen from coming within 50 feet of the job site. It was the first official line drawn between the two women, and it changed the dynamic in a way that felt almost chemical. Karen's response was silence, but not the defeated kind. It was the silence of someone coiling. She didn't make any more comments in public. She stopped standing at her gate with coffee. The dog was no longer seen. But the quiet felt strategic, not remorseful. It was an inhale. Then came the night noises. Annabelle didn't live on site yet, but she visited every evening to check progress, take photos, and walk the property alone. It was a habit she found comforting, a way to connect with the space and ensure nothing was being overlooked. One evening, just after sundown, she heard what sounded like a soft metallic clatter from behind the temporary tool shed at the rear of the lot. She stood still, listening. The sound didn't repeat. She circled wide, flashlight in hand, but found nothing, no footprints in the gravel, no tools missing, no signs of intrusion. She chalked it up to a raccoon or wind through the scaffolding. The next night it happened again, a soft shifting sound, like something being dragged. This time she didn't investigate. She checked the camera logs the next morning instead. The system had motion alerts, one at 9:47 p.m., then again at 10:12 p.m. But when she pulled the footage, the camera feed showed nothing but static during those moments. The files restarted a few minutes later with no gap logged. That was not possible. These weren't consumer-grade cameras, they were meant for industrial use, with tamper detection and auto backup. Annabelle contacted the installation company. The technician who reviewed the system remotely confirmed something chilling. A manual override had been triggered. Someone with physical access to the main control box had entered the override code and reset the device for a short blackout period. Only someone who knew the model intimately could have done that. Annabelle stood in her office, looking at the technician's report, and felt a deep stillness settle in her spine. This wasn't just someone acting out of anger anymore. This was someone planning, someone who had stepped into a different kind of escalation. It wasn't only about her project now, it was about her control, her sense of safety. Karen hadn't just hurled paint, she had cracked the perimeter. Annabelle didn't tell Harriet right away. She waited until she'd reviewed the backup logs, walked the site in daylight, and confirmed the physical lockbox hadn't been breached. No signs of forced entry. No scratches. Nothing disturbed. But someone had been there. The technician had no explanation. He advised replacing the box, upgrading the security code, and adding a fail-safe alert for manual overrides. Annabelle approved all of it. Then she called Harriet. "We're not dealing with someone who's just unhinged," she said quietly. "She's methodical." Harriet's voice was calm but firmer than before. "Then we escalate too. Don't react emotionally, document everything. Let the restraining order stand. If she violates it, we press full charges. But if she goes quiet, that's when we move on the civil front. Her silence won't protect her from liability." Annabelle didn't answer right away. She looked out the window of her office, where the trees beyond the job site swayed in the night breeze. The house was unfinished, but the fight was fully built now. She wasn't chasing justice. She was enforcing boundaries, and some lines, once drawn, stayed permanent. The week following the camera incident shifted something intangible in the rhythm of the build. It wasn't the progress itself. Crews were still showing up, concrete was curing as planned, and the framing was halfway completed, but the way people moved, the way they spoke, had changed. Conversations were shorter. The radio on site, usually playing low country or regional rock, was turned off most days. Even the subcontractors who didn't know the full details of what had happened between Annabelle and the woman across the street could sense the tension. It hung over the property like humidity before a thunderstorm. The temporary restraining order had been filed, processed, and quietly delivered to Karen's address, but there had been no reaction, no breach, no further physical confrontations. And that was what made it worse. No one trusted the silence. It felt rehearsed. Luis hadn't returned yet. His vision was slowly improving, but he needed more time. Annabelle had checked on him twice since the incident. The second time, he asked if his job would still be waiting for him when he was ready. She said, without hesitation, that it would. Still, the rest of the crew felt the absence of his steadiness. The new guy replacing him was younger, less focused, and constantly checking over his shoulder. One morning, he casually asked, "Is it true the neighbor lady's husband used to be a contractor?" Annabelle didn't respond. She didn't like feeding myths. But the rumors had begun to swirl beyond her control. It started with whispers that Karen's late husband had built half the homes on the block. Then someone said he used to inspect city foundations and had friends in the right places. Another claimed Karen still had blueprints from every property she'd ever lived next to, as if she were compiling some master file on who should be allowed to build what. Annabelle didn't pay attention to gossip, but she couldn't ignore its effect. One of the suppliers pushed back a delivery date without explanation. Another requested confirmation that their equipment wouldn't be photographed for non-construction reasons. She'd never heard phrasing like that before, vague and oddly legalistic, but the implication was clear. Someone had planted the idea that doing business with her might carry risk. Not regulatory risk. Social risk. Harriet had predicted it. Public perception doesn't need evidence. It only needs repetition, she'd said after receiving copies of 2 more flyers that had been slipped under windshields at the local hardware store. The photos were grainy. The tone was alarmist. This time the flyer didn't name Annabelle directly but referred to developers bringing outside workers into vulnerable neighborhoods. It warned about insurance liability and claimed ongoing safety incidents at the site. Harriet was preparing a cease and desist notice while the defamation suit inched forward. But defamation law was slow, built for precedent and due process. Annabelle couldn't afford slow. So she adjusted her plan. The following week, Annabelle scheduled a private meeting with the site's general contractor and project foreman. They met off-site at a diner along the bypass, a place with thick ceramic coffee mugs and laminated menus, where people minded their own business. Annabelle laid everything out: the altercation, the surveillance tampering, the flyers, the restraining order. She didn't embellish. She didn't dramatize. She just explained. The foreman, a quiet man in his late 40s named Reggie, listened without interruption, his large hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee. When she was finished, he said, "That woman's not going to stop." "I know," Annabelle said, "but we're going to finish this job." He nodded slowly, then asked the question she knew was coming. "You want extra security?" "I want systems, redundancy, backup protocols. I want us prepared like we're building a federal courthouse, not a house in the suburbs." Reggie's mouth twitched upward. "Copy that." They reorganized their approach that week. No dramatic announcements, no uniforms with security on the back. Just quiet reinforcement. Tools were locked away in coded containers each night. A second set of surveillance cameras was installed independent of the main system, powered by a separate battery array, and uploading off-site every hour. Annabelle didn't mention them to the police or even to Harriet. They weren't meant for court. They were meant for leverage. That same week, something else shifted, this time outside her perimeter. A woman in her 70s, whom Annabelle had only seen from afar tending roses, walked across the street late one afternoon and set a small Tupperware container on the edge of the property. "Peach cobbler," she said. "You don't have to say thank you. Just tired of pretending I don't see what she's doing." Annabelle stood there, momentarily frozen. The woman didn't introduce herself. She just turned and walked away. That night, Annabelle didn't eat the cobbler, but she kept the container. It was the first unprompted gesture of support she'd received from a neighbor since the build began. The next morning, someone left a bag of nails scattered across the site's gravel entrance. The pattern wasn't random. They had been poured in a clean, arched line, directly where trucks entered. The bag itself was branded with a local hardware store's logo. When Reggie reviewed the camera feed, he found nothing: no person, no vehicle, no shadows. Just a 30-minute gap around 2:30 in the morning where the footage skipped, even on the backup system. Annabelle didn't say anything. She just had the gravel regraded and requested floodlights for that corner. Then came the incident with the cement truck. It was scheduled to arrive at 8:45 a.m. for the next phase of foundation pour. It never showed. Instead, a call came in from the dispatch office. The driver had been rerouted by a supposed supervisor who claimed the job was canceled due to a code violation. The dispatch staffer had confirmed the cancellation via a phone call from someone named Harold with engineering. No one by that name existed on the crew. The driver acting on the update had diverted the load to another site across town. Annabelle contacted the company's regional manager and asked to review the call log. He hesitated but complied. The call had come from a number registered to a local landline, not Karen's, someone else's. But the voice was described as an older-sounding woman, clear, authoritative, said she was representing the project. Annabelle filed a police report for impersonation, but again, it was filed under unknown suspect. There was no proof it was Karen, but Annabelle knew. She didn't voice that certainty. She didn't make accusations on social media or hold press conferences or rant in public. Instead, she did what she had always done in the face of obstruction. She documented every call, every missed delivery, every delay. She began keeping a handwritten ledger, updated nightly, noting time, date, names, and results. Not for court, though it might come to that, but because some battles were won not through confrontation but accumulation. Harriet advised patience. The more patterns we can show, the stronger our case becomes, she said. People like her get bold. She'll cross the line again. She already has. Annabelle understood. But patience wasn't passivity. She filed formal complaints with the city's licensing office about interference with commercial deliveries. She alerted her insurer and upgraded her construction bond to account for external disruption risk. She even ordered new signage, 2 large placards affixed to the inside of the fence, facing outward. One said, "Private construction. Trespassing will be prosecuted." The other had a QR code linking to a live, read-only log of every obstruction, incident, and false report associated with the build. Karen saw them. The next day, she walked her dog down the opposite side of the street for the first time since spring. Annabelle didn't watch her go. She had more important things to do. Because this wasn't about escalation anymore. It was about resilience. And the woman standing in the dust and metal bones of her rising home had built stronger things than walls before she'd built systems, policies, city infrastructure. She understood what it meant to withstand pressure. Karen had made a mistake not just in attacking a person, but in underestimating the structure of a mind trained for the long war. Annabelle wasn't trying to win anymore. She was waiting. The midpoint of any conflict is rarely announced with fireworks or banners. It slips in quietly, like a change in weather, subtle, but unmistakable. For Annabelle, it came not through a dramatic confrontation or new attack, but in the form of a city compliance envelope, a hand delivered by a municipal inspector who arrived unannounced one humid Wednesday morning. The man was polite, middle-aged, with a clipboard under one arm and a hollow tone that said he'd rather be anywhere else. He introduced himself only as Mr. Trent and stated that the site had been reported for non-compliance on multiple counts: noise outside of permitted hours, unpermitted drainage alteration, and improper disposal of hazardous materials. Annabelle stood still while he listed the infractions, each one more absurd than the last. None of it was true, and she knew it wasn't even intended to be believed. It was about interruption, stalling, pulling attention away from the build and back onto defense. When she asked to see the reports, Trent handed her 3 pages printed in black and white. They were complaints, anonymous but clearly written by someone familiar with the terminology used in construction code, someone who knew how to phrase exaggerations just close enough to plausible. The language was bureaucratic, precise, and unmistakably strategic. Trent didn't seem interested in enforcing anything. He walked the site with a distracted air, asked a few procedural questions, and nodded at her answers with the weary resignation of a man who'd been used as a pawn. "I'll be honest," he said after finishing the walkthrough, "this is clearly a harassment complaint. But we still have to follow up. Paperwork's paperwork." He gave her a form to sign, confirming the inspection had been completed, and then added quietly, "You're not the first to deal with her. She's had 3 of these flagged in the last 5 years, all dropped after review." Annabelle looked at him, expression unreadable. She didn't ask for details. She just thanked him, signed the form, and walked him out to the gate. The visit left her pacing that night. She didn't usually dwell. Her mind was trained for strategy, not rumination. But something about the tone of Trent's voice, the familiarity in how he'd said her, triggered a deeper question. How long had Karen been leveraging institutional processes to control her environment? How many had simply walked away rather than push back? If Annabelle hadn't had the legal knowledge, the money, or the stubborn will to resist, would she have done the same? Later that night, Harriet confirmed her suspicions. "Karen's got a pattern. I ran her name through municipal inquiry logs. She's not a criminal, not technically. But she's a chronic complainant. 4 registered filings over 10 years, all against new construction or renovations near her property. 1 builder dropped a project entirely. Another spent 9 months stuck in litigation before the city dismissed it. Karen knows exactly how to weaponize the gray areas." Then Harriet hesitated. "And there's something else." Annabelle leaned in slightly, the kind of stillness that came only when she braced for impact. "Go on." "She's not acting alone this time." Harriet forwarded an internal memo from a private security firm hired during one of Karen's previous conflicts. Their report had noted irregularities, calls being made from third-party lines, documents arriving anonymously but containing matching phrasing, a few false social media profiles used to escalate rumors and discredit homeowners. It wasn't just that Karen was persistent. She was organized. Whether she worked with someone else this time was unclear, but the signs were familiar. Annabelle didn't react with fear or even frustration. She felt something more elemental, curiosity sharpened by caution. Karen wasn't just a disgruntled neighbor. She was orchestrating something more deliberate and possibly more systemic. The attack with the paint had been visceral, but this was cerebral. Long play. And Annabelle, for the first time in weeks, saw the shape of the game more clearly. That was when she made the decision to go to the mediation session. It had been offered by the city as a voluntary dispute resolution meeting, an informal setting in which both parties could air grievances and attempt to come to understanding. Initially, Annabelle had declined. There was nothing to understand. But now, with the civil case gaining momentum and Karen's tactics becoming more tactical, Annabelle saw the value in stepping into the room not to negotiate but to listen. She needed to see the full scope of what she was up against. The session was held in a neutral facility, one of those government buildings with outdated carpeting, fluorescent lights, and motivational posters from another decade. The mediator was a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and the overly calm tone of someone trained to de-escalate tension, not resolve it. Karen arrived 10 minutes late, dressed in a beige pantsuit and wearing a performative calm that barely covered the tension in her jaw. She sat across the table without a word, slid a folder forward, and folded her hands in front of her like a school principal about to deliver a warning. Annabelle didn't flinch. The mediator opened the session with the usual rehearsed language about respect, intention, and dialogue. Karen interrupted within the first 3 minutes. "This entire construction is a disruption. It's not only an eyesore, it's invasive. The noise, the smells, the type of people she brings in." Her voice was low but purposeful, and she never looked at Annabelle. "Our neighborhood has character. We've worked to maintain that. Now it's being turned into something unfamiliar." Annabelle remained quiet. She didn't interrupt. She wanted to hear how far Karen would go. She's brought in non-local workers, increased traffic, deliveries at odd hours, and she's refused to engage with any of the community's suggestions. There's been dangerous activity, property damage. I was assaulted verbally when I expressed concern. And her security cameras point directly at my home, an invasion of privacy. Annabelle turned slightly toward the mediator. Everything she's just said is either a fabrication or a distortion of observable fact. I haven't responded until now because I wanted the legal process to take its course. But since we're here... She paused, then slid forward her own folder. I've brought full documentation. Permits, schedules, police reports, time-stamped video footage, including the incident involving my employee. And since she brought up privacy, I should note that her own cameras, yes. We've seen them have been aimed toward my property long before mine were installed. Karen's eyes narrowed. The calm cracked for a moment. She's twisting everything. She's manipulating this into a witch hunt against me. The mediator raised a hand gently. Let's focus on specific impacts. Karen, what would you consider a reasonable compromise? Karen turned, her eyes gleaming with certainty. She moves the project to a location that fits the aesthetic and social fabric of this neighborhood. This isn't a warehouse district. It's residential. It was so absurd, Annabelle almost laughed. Almost. I bought this land legally, she said quietly. I'm building within the zoning regulations. And I don't need her approval or yours to define my home. The session ended without agreement. But Annabelle had gotten what she came for. Karen wasn't trying to delay construction or inconvenience her. She was trying to erase her. She didn't see Annabelle as a neighbor. She saw her as an intruder, a threat to an order that existed only in Karen's mind, a curated reality where she was still the unchallenged voice of the block, the one whose opinion mattered most. And Annabelle, by building something outside of that imagined boundary, had become the enemy. As she walked to her car afterward, Harriet called, "Well?" Annabelle got in, shut the door, and exhaled slowly. She thinks she's fighting for territory. And you? I'm building a house. She hung up. That weekend, as framing resumed and the upper levels began to take shape, something new happened. 3 neighbors she'd never spoken to directly dropped by the fence, not all at once, but separately. One brought coffee. Another asked if he could help haul plywood. The third simply stood for a few minutes and said, "I didn't know the whole story." She made it sound different. Annabelle didn't make speeches. She accepted the coffee. She let the man help with plywood. She thanked the woman for stopping by. And inside she recognized the shift. Not everyone had bought into Karen's narrative. Some just hadn't known there was another side to it. Now they did. But Karen had noticed too. 2 days later, one of the support beams on the southern edge of the site was found loosened deliberately. No sign of forced entry. No cameras caught it. But the bolt had been partially removed and rethreaded backward. If they hadn't caught it before the pour, it could have failed under weight. This wasn't symbolic anymore. Someone was actively trying to compromise the build. And Annabelle, standing at the center of her unfinished home, no longer had any doubt. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was war. Annabelle no longer hoped for the situation to calm down. That idea had expired the day she found the loosened support bolt unscrewed not by accident or fatigue, but by deliberate hand, with enough precision to suggest someone knew exactly how far to go without making it immediately obvious. The foreman had found it during his early walkthrough, double-checking connections before the next round of insulation went up. When he showed her the bolt, half-inserted with a smear of fresh rust along the thread, he didn't speculate. He didn't need to. Annabelle looked at it for a long time in silence, then said only, "Catalog it. Photograph everything. Send it to Harriet." From that point forward, she stopped thinking in terms of de-escalation. The conversation had shifted no longer about construction delays or neighborhood tension, but about structural sabotage, targeted manipulation, and the presence of someone who believed they could operate in shadow forever. Security was tightened, not in a theatrical way. There were no guards pacing the property or mounted lights flooding the night, but the systems were upgraded again. Silent sensors were installed beneath the gravel entry points, set to alert by weight displacement. Trail cams were placed discreetly behind the lot, facing away from the build toward the woods and utility access lanes that someone might use to approach undetected. One of the workers, an older guy named Ray, who'd spent 20 years on commercial projects before semi-retiring, suggested using decoy equipment to lure any future tampering attempts. People like that, he said, they want to feel smarter than you. Leave them something obvious, just off enough to make them think they found your weak point. That's where they slip up. Annabelle approved the idea. And yet, despite the increased vigilance, the attacks became less about the site and more about her. That week, someone filed a formal complaint with the local Board of Architectural Review, not about the legality of her structure, but about its psychological impact on the surrounding neighborhood. The wording in the complaint was surreal. It accused her design of being hostile in posture, symbolically violent, and aesthetic colonialism. Annabelle read the document twice before setting it down. Whoever had written it was educated, articulate, and deeply manipulative. It sounded like art school jargon twisted into a weapon. And while there was no signature, no attribution, Harriet cross-referenced key phrases and found a blog post from 3 years ago, archived but still visible, in which Karen had commented using similar language to describe a city mural she had opposed. The pattern was no longer theoretical. It was deliberate, iterative, escalating. And Annabelle, who had once thought she could outlast this madness through professionalism and paperwork, realized she was being hunted psychologically. Not just to stop her build, to erase her will, she responded accordingly. The next day, she filed a motion to make the temporary restraining order permanent. Harriet warned that they'd need stronger evidence, so Annabelle gave it to her. She compiled everything: incident logs, worker affidavits, the sabotage photos, the rerouted deliveries, and now the architectural board complaint that, combined with Karen's historical footprint of behavioral manipulation. Harriet submitted it all. At the same time, Annabelle drafted a formal liability notice and sent it via certified mail to Karen's address. It stated clearly that any further interference, direct or indirect, would be pursued as civil harassment, and any resulting damage would be met with full legal response. No room for interpretation. 3 days later, her mailbox was torn off the post. Not knocked loose or dented, ripped out, thrown into her driveway, and crushed beneath what looked like the tire marks of an SUV. The camera pointed at the road caught only the aftermath. The car had approached from the blind side, lights off, then reversed and disappeared before any detail could be made out. No license plate, no silhouette, just one long screech and the sound of metal folding. Annabelle stood over the wreckage in the morning haze, holding a coffee mug in one hand, and didn't move for several minutes. She was tired, yes, worn down by the constant readiness. But in that moment, something else hardened inside her. She no longer saw Karen as an opponent. She saw her as a failing structure, a cracked foundation barely holding weight, desperate to mask its own instability by attacking the integrity of others. It wasn't just ego or control. It was decay. And it was rotting everything it touched. Still, the law didn't move at the pace of emotion. The restraining order extension required a hearing, and Karen, in a move that surprised no one, denied all allegations and demanded her right to appear in person. Her response was riddled with indignation, claiming victimhood, citing health issues, and accusing Annabelle of harassment, stalking, and orchestrating neighborhood alienation. Harriet read the document aloud over the phone, then sighed and said, "She's cornered. That makes her reckless." That recklessness became evident one night in late August when the secondary storage trailer on the site was broken into. Nothing valuable was stolen, at least not in the traditional sense. But the contents of several boxes had been pulled out, scattered, and left open under the elements. Construction plans, labeled samples, insulation guides, all paper materials, all drenched and warped from overnight rain. Someone had forced the lock, pried open the door, and selectively trashed only what couldn't be replaced with a quick phone call. There were no fingerprints, no footprints that held shape in the gravel. But the trail cam facing the far fence line caught a blur of movement, someone small-framed, wearing a hood, moving quickly with a hunched posture. It wasn't proof, but it was enough. Annabelle submitted it with the other materials. Harriet began preparing for court. But Karen didn't wait. 2 days before the scheduled hearing, Annabelle's builder received an anonymous letter printed, unsigned, claiming that the site was being investigated for code violations and that continued work would be in contempt of city protocols. It used official-sounding language but contained no department names, no reference numbers, and no signatures. Just implied threat. Reggie showed it to Annabelle, his jaw tight. "If this was meant to scare me off," he said, "they clearly didn't ask around about me first." He handed her the letter. "We're staying on the job, but you should know this is turning heads." Annabelle didn't answer right away. She stood at the edge of the foundation, where the first glass panels had just arrived for the west-facing wall. She imagined them shattered in the night. She imagined Karen pacing in her kitchen, imagining the same. She turned back to Reggie. "Install them anyway." The next morning, a complaint was filed with the utility company alleging illegal power routing at her site. A technician came, apologized, inspected the box, found nothing, and left. Then came a report to animal control. Someone claimed they'd seen dangerous stray dogs on her property, possibly aggressive. No such animals existed. Then came an anonymous email to the city ethics board, accusing her of bribery in a zoning matter from years before. Harriet called it what it was, a smear barrage. She's trying to drown the signal in noise. She knows the court date is close. That hearing where the temporary restraining order would be reviewed and potentially extended into permanence became the line in the sand. On the morning of the court date, Annabelle dressed not for effect, but for clarity, neutral tones, structured lines. She looked like who she was, a professional with no time for theater. Harriet met her outside the courthouse with a binder thick enough to anchor a small boat. Karen arrived in a tan blazer, hair styled in soft curls, holding a handkerchief as if expecting tears. She walked with a slight limp that neither Annabelle nor Harriet had ever seen before. She looked every inch the aggrieved party. In court, the judge, a woman in her 50s with a face made for silence, reviewed the documentation in silence for 20 minutes before speaking. When she did, it was with startling economy. "Miss Brooks," she said, "you are not on trial. This is not a defamation case. But I've reviewed the cumulative evidence provided. This is not a misunderstanding between neighbors. This is an ongoing campaign of personal interference with a legal construction project. The restraining order will be made permanent and expanded to include digital contact, proxy harassment, and indirect interference through third parties." Karen's jaw trembled, but she said nothing. Not one word. The gavel came down with a sound that felt, for the first time in weeks, like air returning to the room. Outside, Harriet exhaled and closed the binder. "You'll still need to watch your back," she said, "but she can't hide anymore. Any step now, and it's contempt." Annabelle nodded. She didn't celebrate. She didn't speak to the press. She went back to the site, walked the perimeter, and watched her house continue to rise. It wasn't over, but it had changed, and she wasn't building in fear anymore. She was finishing what she started. The first rain in weeks came 2 nights after the court ruling. It wasn't the kind of cinematic downpour that crashes against windows and howls through trees, but a slow, insistent kind of rain, one that softened the edges of everything, turned gravel to mud, and soaked quietly into wood that hadn't yet been sealed. The crew had covered most of the materials, but the sky caught them between shipments, and a pallet of insulation had to be tossed the next morning. Annabelle didn't complain. She stood under the overhang at the south edge of the structure, arms folded, listening to the low thud of drops on plywood, thinking not about weather damage, but about pressure, how it never really vanished, only shifted forms. The ruling had felt like a victory, but she hadn't let herself believe that it would end things. Not really. Not with someone like Karen. The following day was quiet, unnaturally so. No deliveries were delayed. No anonymous complaints were filed. No shadows appeared on the far side of the property. Even the neighborhood, usually brimming with motion dog walkers, joggers, the quiet hum of morning errands felt subdued. Annabelle couldn't decide if it was the weather or something else, but the silence rang too cleanly, like air sucked out of a sealed room. Harriet called to check in. "Still nothing?" she asked. "Nothing yet," Annabelle replied. "But I don't trust stillness." And she was right. That Friday, around 3 a.m., the security system logged an anomaly. Not motion, those were frequent, and often just raccoons or wind-triggered branches, but a full manual reset attempt on the Westgate's digital pad. Whoever it was knew the model well enough to attempt a bypass, but not well enough to do it correctly. The system didn't just log the attempt, it activated a silent alert, and for the first time, sent a real-time ping to the backup security team Annabelle had contracted through her builder weeks earlier, just in case. By the time they arrived, the intruder was gone, but footprints were visible in the mud, deep and frantic. Not Karen's. Too large. Possibly a man's. Annabelle reviewed the footage herself. It was blurry but usable. A tall figure in a hooded rain jacket, crouching near the keypad, gloved hands moving quickly, then pausing, standing, pacing, then bolting out of frame as headlights from the approaching truck hit the fence. The man had come alone. No vehicle was seen nearby. Harriet was notified the next morning. She forwarded the clip to the police. The restraining order had been clear. Karen was forbidden from using proxies to interfere. If this was tied to her, it was a criminal offense now, not civil. Annabelle didn't speculate. She submitted the footage, made a statement, then returned to work. The incident wasn't frightening, just confirming. The message was clear. Someone still thought this build was a threat. 2 days later, Annabelle's electrician arrived early to find the lockbox tampered with. Nothing was stolen, but someone had attempted to short the main line. Sloppy work. Dangerous, too. If the panel had been active, it could have ignited the adjacent insulation. The worker flagged it, secured the area, and called Annabelle directly. By the time she arrived, city fire code officials were already inspecting. The police followed an hour later. Reports were filed. The fire inspector's assessment read, malicious tampering intent to disrupt, possible arson risk. Harriet's tone changed after that. We're moving into felony territory. If it's Karen, she's going to get dragged into criminal court. But if she's pushing someone else forward, it's going to be harder to pin. Annabelle knew it. They both did. There was no solid proof yet, only patterns, motives, proximity. And those were hard to prosecute without a name. But there were other ways to corner people. That afternoon, Harriet filed a discovery motion to subpoena Karen's phone records. If she'd coordinated anything, there'd be a trail, even a burner phone connected to her main line, even a text forward. And if there was a name, a nephew, a tenant, a handyman, Harriet would find it. The case was no longer about civil harassment. It was about targeting, escalation, and criminal conspiracy. But Karen beat them to the next move. The night before the subpoena was to be reviewed by the judge, someone sent an envelope to the site, tucked under the temporary office door. It contained a single piece of paper, printed in large serif font. No name, no signature, no threats, just one sentence. You think you've won, but houses burn and people forget who built them. Annabelle held the page without reacting. Reggie saw it too. That's not crazy, he muttered. That's strategy, she agreed. It was the language of someone who'd lost in court, and now wanted to win on a different field, one made of memory and pressure. Harriet instructed her to turn the letter over to the police, which she did. But privately, Annabelle did something else. She called a local reporter. Not to go public. Not yet, but to start a quiet file. She gave them the broad strokes unnamed harassment, sabotage, legal process, and said, "If anything happens to this site or anyone on it, you'll know where to look." The reporter didn't ask questions, just listened and agreed. Some truths needed time to ferment. The next evening, Annabelle stayed late. She wasn't watching or waiting. She was working, scanning final drafts for cabinetry installation, comparing elevations, double-checking vendor quotes. Around 10:30 p.m., as she packed up, she heard the faint sound of tires crunching gravel outside the gate. Not unusual, but not typical for that hour. She turned off her lights and stood near the window. A car, compact, silver, mid-2000s, sat idling just outside the fence. Headlights off. No one exited. She watched for 10 minutes. Then the car drove away. No plate was visible. No silhouette. But the message was clear. She wasn't meant to be scared. She was meant to be exhausted. It almost worked. But exhaustion wasn't defeat. It was data. And Annabelle recorded every moment. Every plateless car, every torn document, every bolt that didn't sit right. This wasn't just about defending a build. It was about defending the right to persist, to create, to shape space, to own one's direction. The court approved the subpoena a week later. And the records revealed what Harriet suspected. There is a number, repeatedly contacted, connected to a man with a history of minor property crimes, trespassing, unlawful entry, vandalism, nothing violent, but enough to paint a picture. The man's name appeared again in a private message on an online forum used for anonymous neighborhood safety alerts. The account that posted the message had ties to Karen's Wi-Fi network. Enough threads to weave a case. When the police arrived at Karen's home with the warrant, she didn't resist. She also didn't deny anything. She simply said, "I didn't tell him what to do. He wanted to help. I can't control what other people do." But her phone said otherwise. And so did the man when questioned. Annabelle wasn't there when the arrest happened. She didn't need to be. She was walking the main hallway of her nearly finished home, tracing her fingers along the newly installed glass, watching sunlight bend around the steel beams. She thought about how many people had told her to stop, to delay, to move. How many believed the smarter move would have been to sell and walk away. But she stayed, not to win, not to punish. But because sometimes the refusal to surrender becomes the only act of clarity left. Outside, the rain returned light, steady, unthreatening. Inside, the walls stood. And so did she. The house was finished in early November, just as the last of the leaves began to turn brittle and scatter across the sidewalks. The construction crew had moved with silent precision in the final weeks, well beyond contract minimums, driven not just by schedule but by something unspoken respect, perhaps, or quiet solidarity. Annabelle never asked them to stay late or push harder. They just did. The final coat of sealant dried over the weekend, the interior passed inspection without a single correction, and the keys were handed over on a Monday morning that smelled like frost and concrete dust. Annabelle didn't throw a housewarming party. There were no invitations, no champagne glasses, no ceremonial walkthrough. Instead, she unpacked her boxes slowly, methodically, as she always had in every new space she ever claimed. She hung no art. She placed no furniture. The structure itself was the statement, and it was enough. Tall windows framed the autumn like still life paintings. The glass reflected no one but her. The door shut with a sound that felt final, as though it had been waiting for months to exhale. Karen Brooks pled guilty in exchange for leniency. Her lawyer negotiated the terms in a closed hearing with no press allowed. One felony count, conspiracy to commit property damage, and a misdemeanor harassment charge. No jail time, but restitution payments, mandatory community service, psychiatric evaluation, and a restraining order so ironclad it made the original one look like a formality. Annabelle didn't attend the sentencing. Harriet went in her place. The statement Annabelle had written was read aloud by the clerk. I did not build this house to provoke anyone. I did not design it to make a point. I built it because I had the right to create a place for myself that reflected who I was. The person who tried to stop me misunderstood something fundamental. It's not the building that threatens them. It's the refusal to conform, and no one has to conform to live in peace. Harriet said Karen had sat motionless during the reading. No tears, no interruptions, just stillness. Not shame, not regret, just stillness. The man who tampered with the site, whose name never made it to the public, was sentenced separately. His cooperation in the investigation gave him a reduced charge. He admitted to acting under the belief that he was helping preserve the community. He'd never even met Karen in person. Annabelle didn't pursue civil damages beyond what was necessary to cover the repairs and delays. Harriet had suggested more aggressive financial action, but Annabelle declined. Not out of mercy. Out of exhaustion. Winning meant nothing if the fight itself became your identity. She had built what she came to build. That was the line. She wouldn't let anything pull her past it. For weeks after moving in, the house remained quiet, not empty, but uncluttered. Her routines returned. Early mornings, strong coffee. Long evenings in the quiet hum of filtered air and muted daylight. The world outside her window was still the same: trimmed lawns, symmetrical shutters, polite silence. Some neighbors waved again. A few nodded. One elderly man left a note in her mailbox, written in pencil. I didn't understand at first. I do now. Thank you for staying. She folded the paper neatly and kept it in a drawer. Not as a trophy. As a reminder that resistance wasn't always loud, it could be quiet and slow and eventually understood. The local paper ran a small story 2 months later, buried near the back pages: residents sentenced in harassment case involving construction site sabotage. No names, just facts. A few people in the neighborhood brought it up, carefully, tentatively. Annabelle didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Everyone knew who it was about. Everyone knew who had stayed and who had broken. Karen sold her house within 60 days of the sentence. It sat empty for a month before a young couple bought it. They renovated immediately: new paint, new fencing, solar panels on the roof. A child's bicycle appeared on the lawn within a week of move-in. Annabelle watched from across the street as life resumed, not louder but freer. Karen had left no legacy, no warnings. Just a vacancy filled by people who didn't know the history and didn't need to. That was the most fitting ending of all. The structural engineer who inspected the final work sent Annabelle a message weeks after sign-off. It read, "Most builds I forget. This one I won't." Not because of the concrete, but because of the backbone. She saved that one too. One afternoon, just before winter settled in, Annabelle stood on the rear balcony that overlooked the small wooded trail at the edge of her lot. The light came in low, golden, catching the grain of the exposed beams and the clean lines of her railing. A breeze moved through the trees like a breath. She stood still for a long time, breathing with it. She thought about the bolts that had been loosened, the flyers, the thrown paint, the nights of silence designed to wear her down, the envelope, the false complaints, the smear attempts. She thought about Luis, his quiet integrity, about Reggie and Ray, about the old woman with the cobbler, about the neighbors who had watched, afraid to pick sides, about the reporter she never needed to call again, or about Harriet, who never once told her to back down, only how to do it right. She thought about fear and how it always tries to disguise itself as authority. But most of all, she thought about resolve. Not the kind that swells up with speeches and defiance, but the quieter kind. The kind that shows up every morning at the same time. That pours coffee, checks systems, reads fine print, signs contracts, shows up in court, reviews the lighting angles, adjusts the plans, refines the finishes, secures the perimeter, and never, ever gives up ground it has the right to stand on. When she turned to go back inside, she glanced once more at the frame of her home and the reflection of the sliding glass door. There were no signs of battle left. No reminders carved into the wood or burned into the walls. Only the shape she had chosen, the angles she had drawn, the space she had protected. It was done. No one would ask her to justify it again. No one would take it from her. And she had nothing left to explain,